It is March of 1940, and a 55-year-old man stands guard in a muddy English village. He wears an armband that reads LDV, Local Defense Volunteers. His weapon is a piece of drainpipe with a bayonet welded to its end, a homemade pike crafted from scaffolding, and a 1913 Remington bayonet. 18 months earlier, this same man commanded Britain's premier tank division in the scorching deserts of Egypt. He was a Major General, one of the most brilliant military minds of his generation, a man whose revolutionary ideas about armored warfare had attracted the attention of generals across Europe, including the Germans who were about to conquer France using his theories. Now he is Lance Corporal Percy Hobart of the Chipping-Campden Home Guard, armed with a homemade pike, defending his village against a German invasion that everyone expects will come any day. He is transported to his duties in a baby Austin driven by a member of the Women's Volunteer Services. His rank insignia, a single stripe, seems almost mocking on a man who once wore a general's insignia. How did one of the British Army's greatest tank pioneers end up here? And how did a desperate phone call from Winston Churchill transform this forgotten corporal into the architect of D-Day's most devastating secret weapons? This is the story of the general they demoted to corporal until D-Day changed everything. Percy Hobart's story isn't just about tanks and tactics. It's about what happens when a brilliant mind collides with institutional thinking. It's about the price of being right when everyone in power disagrees with you. And it's about redemption, about getting a second chance to prove that the idea you were punished for were exactly what your country needed to survive. The specialized tanks that Hobart developed, swimming tanks that could float ashore under their own power, mine-clearing tanks that flailed the earth with chains, flame-throwing tanks that could incinerate bunkers, bunker-busting tanks that fired massive demolition bombs, would help crack Hitler's Atlantic Wall on June 6, 1944. On the beaches where Allied forces used Hobart's inventions, casualties were a fraction of those where they didn't. The contrast was so stark that it would haunt military planners for decades. But before we can understand the triumph, we need to understand the fall. We need to understand how the British Army could take one of its most valuable assets and throw him away like yesterday's garbage. In the years between the World Wars, the British Army was locked in a bitter struggle between two visions of modern warfare. On one side stood the cavalry traditionalists, men who believed that the horse remained the noblest and most essential element of military power. These officers dominated the high commands, controlled promotions, and wielded enormous influence in Parliament. Many of them had grown up in families with cavalry traditions, stretching back generations. The horse wasn't just a military tool to them, it was a way of life. On the other side stood a small band of tank enthusiasts who saw the future in the clanking smoke, belching machines that had first appeared on the battlefields of the Somme in 1916. These men believed that tanks would make cavalry obsolete, that armored formations could break through enemy lines and drive deep into their rear, disrupting communications and shattering morale. They spoke of strategic mobility, of battles decided in days rather than months, of wars won without the grinding attrition of trenches. The cavalry faction had tradition, prestige, and political connections. The tank enthusiasts had logic, evidence, and Percy Hobart. As late as 1936, the Secretary of War stood up in Parliament and apologized to the cavalry for mechanizing 8 of their regiments, apologized as if replacing horses with tanks was somehow an insult rather than progress. This was the institutional culture that Percy Hobart had to fight against for his entire career. Percy Cleghorn Stanley Hobart was born on June 14, 1885, in Nainital, a picturesque hill station in the Kumaon region of British India. Nestled in the foothills of the Himalayas, at an elevation of nearly 7,000 feet, Nainital offered British colonial families a refuge from the brutal heat of the Indian plains. It was here, surrounded by pine forests and mountain lakes, that young Percy first opened his eyes to the world. His father, Robert Thompson Hobart, served in the Indian Civil Service, the prestigious administrative corps that governed the subcontinent. The ICES was the steel frame of the British Empire, and Robert Hobart was part of that elite cadre. His mother, Janetta Charlotte Catherine Josephine Stanley, came from County Tyrone in Northern Ireland, from a family with roots at Ruffin Park near Newmilns. Young Percy showed early signs of the intellectual breadth that would later define him. While other boys dreamed of cavalry charges and colonial adventures, he immersed himself in history, painting, literature, and church architecture. His education at Temple Grove School and then Clifton College in Bristol marked him as a classics scholar before he ever picked up a rifle. He was curious about everything, impatient with anything he considered foolish, utterly unwilling to accept conventional wisdom, just because it was conventional. In 1901, at age 16, Hobart entered the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, the training ground for officers destined for the technical branches of the British Army. 3 years later, in July 1904, he graduated and received his commission as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Royal Engineers. The Royal Engineers were known for innovation, mechanical expertise, and problem-solving, qualities that would serve Hobart well in the decades to come. He was posted to India, serving with the 1st Bengal sappers and miners from 1906 to 1915. In 1908, he saw action during the Normandy expedition on the turbulent northwest frontier, his first taste of combat. By the time the Great War erupted in 1914, Captain Hobart had nearly a decade of military experience and a reputation for both brilliance and insubordination that would follow him for life. The First World War transformed Percy Hobart. It transformed everyone who fought in it, but Hobart emerged with convictions that would shape military history. In 1915, serving as a staff officer with the Indian Corps in France, he participated in some of the bloodiest battles on the Western Front: Neuve-Chapelle in March, Orbus Ridge in May, Festubert that same month. He saw thousands of men sent to drown in the mud and barbed wire of no man's land, advancing at tremendous cost for gains measured in yards rather than miles. The mathematics of the Western Front were brutal. Artillery bombardment that churned the earth into impassable moonscapes, machine guns that could cut down entire battalions in minutes, trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. For his service, Hobart was awarded the Military Cross in 1915, but he had seen enough to question everything the traditional army believed about warfare. There had to be a better way than feeding men into machine guns, and hoping that this time, somehow, courage alone would carry the day. In early 1916, Hobart transferred to Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, joining the desperate British effort to relieve the besieged garrison at Kut al-Amara. The relief failed catastrophically. On April 29th, approximately 13,000 British and Indian troops surrendered to the Ottoman forces in one of Britain's greatest military humiliations of the war. During these operations, Hobart served on the staff of an Indian Army infantry brigade tasked with the relief attempts. He organized river crossings, established supply lines, and coordinated engineering operations under constant enemy fire. He was wounded in action and briefly taken prisoner by the Turks before being recovered. For his gallantry in the Mesopotamia campaign, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, gazetted on June 24, 1916. By 1917, Hobart was serving under General Sir Stanley Maude during the successful advance on Baghdad. His final campaign was in Palestine during 1918, where he participated in the Battle of Megiddo, the decisive victory that destroyed Ottoman power in the Middle East. It was a battle of movement, of cavalry and armored cars, sweeping through gaps in the enemy line, of rapid exploitation that prevented the Turks from ever establishing a new defensive position. By war's end, Hobart had accumulated 9 mentions and dispatches, an OBE to add to his MC and DSO. A profound conviction that there had to be a better way to wage war than feeding men into machine guns. The static warfare of the Western Front was madness. Megiddo pointed the way forward: mobility, speed, exploitation. After the war, Hobart attended Stark College at Camberley in 1920, then served briefly at the War Office. But his mind kept returning to those grinding years in France and that liberating campaign in Palestine. What made the difference? What could restore movement to warfare? In 1923, Percy Hobart made the decision that would define his career. He volunteered to transfer from the Royal Engineers to the newly formed Royal Tank Corps. It was a gamble. The Royal Engineers were a prestigious, established corps with centuries of tradition. The Royal Tank Corps was new, underfunded, and despised by the cavalry establishment. Transferring meant abandoning a safe career path for an uncertain future in an arm of service that many believed would never amount to anything. Some of his fellow officers thought he had lost his mind, but Hobart had read the writings of military theorists J.F.C. Fuller and especially Basil Liddell-Hart, who argued passionately for the doctrine of strategic mobility. The idea that tanks could restore movement to warfare breaking through enemy lines and striking deep into their rear just as the Mongol horsemen had done centuries before. Liddell Hart held that tanks would restore to 20th century warfare the ancient Mongolian concept of extreme mobility, the Mongols' main instrument of conquest. Why piddle about making porridge with artillery? Hobart later demanded, then sent men to drown themselves in it for 100 yards of no man's land. Tanks mean advances of miles at a time, not yards. From 1923 to 1927, Hobart served as an instructor at Staff College, Quetta, in what is now Pakistan. There he delivered lectures on tank warfare that drew on both his combat experience and his voracious reading. He developed friendships with like-minded officers and forged a close relationship with Liddell Hart himself, a partnership that would prove crucial to his eventual salvation. In November 1928, Hobart's personal life became entangled with controversy. He married Dorothea Field, the daughter of Colonel Seafield of the Royal Marines, after her divorce from another officer. In an era when divorce carried severe social stigma, Hobart's involvement in breaking up a fellow officer's marriage nearly ended his career. The War Office issued a stern warning that any officer who disrupted the marriage of a brother officer in his own regiment would be expected to resign his commission. Hobart survived only because he was in the Royal Tank Corps, while the divorced officer was a Royal Engineer, technically different regiments. But he had made enemies. Lieutenant General Sir Robert Gordon Finlayson, among others, never forgave him. These enemies would remember, and they would wait for their chance. By the early 1930s, Hobart had become one of the world's foremost experts on armored warfare. He didn't just theorize, he experimented, tested, and proved his concepts in exercises that attracted international attention. In 1931, Hobart took command of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Tank Corps. 2 years later, he was promoted to Inspector General of the RTC with the rank of Brigadier General. He formed a strong friendship with Basil Liddell Hart, and together they developed the concepts that would eventually become known as Blitzkrieg, though it would be the Germans, not the British, who first used them in combat. Hobart was among the first to exploit radio communication for tactical command and control of armored formation. Before him, tank commanders had to rely on flags, runners, or simply hoping their subordinates would do the right thing. Hobart showed that radio-coordinated tank units could maneuver with precision, concentrate force at decisive points, and responding instantly to changing conditions. He developed the techniques of wireless control required for fast-moving operations. He proved that armored units could both travel and fight by night, a revolutionary concept that forced complete revision of strategic thinking. Suddenly, darkness no longer provided protection against armored attack. An enemy that thought itself safe until dawn might find tanks in its rear by midnight. Most importantly, he demonstrated the feasibility of deep strategic penetration, driving fast-moving armored units to the enemy's rear to disrupt their entire organization. This wasn't just tactical innovation. It was a complete reimagining of how wars could be fought and won. Instead of grinding forward yard by bloody yard, armored forces could leap over enemy defenses and collapse them from behind. In April of 1934, Hobart became the first commander of the 1st Tank Brigade at Perham Down, the world's first permanent armored brigade organized on modern lines. His exercises on Salisbury Plain that August were filmed by Pathé Gazette and studied by military observers around the world. The tanks maneuvered in coordinated formations, communicated by radio, struck at objectives miles behind the enemy front line. One officer who paid particularly close attention was German General Heinz Guderian. At his own expense, Guderian hired translators to convert all of Hobart's published articles into German. "I put my faith in Hobart, the new man," Guderian reportedly said. The German army was building panzer divisions based on principles that Hobart had pioneered but that the British army refused to adopt. The irony would prove devastating. The man whose ideas Guderian would use to conquer France was being forced out of the British army before he could defend against them. Following the Munich crisis of September 1938, when war with Germany seemed imminent, Hobart was dispatched to Egypt with orders to raise and train Mobile Force Egypt, Britain's 2nd Modern Armoured Division. He arrived in October 1938, promoted to Major General, and threw himself into the task with characteristic intensity. What he found was discouraging. The units assigned to him were scattered, under strength, poorly equipped, and undertrained. Equipment was obsolete or missing entirely. Morale was low. The garrison mentality of peacetime Egypt had sapped the fighting spirit from units that should have been the spearhead of British power in the Middle East. For 14 months, Hobart worked to transform this unpromising material into a formidable fighting force. He dragged his men into the desert for exercises that lasted weeks. He trained them in desert navigation using sun compasses and dead reckoning. He taught them to adapt their equipment to the harsh conditions, the sand that clogged engines, the heat that blistered metal, distances that made logistics a nightmare. He trained them in combined arms coordination, bringing together tanks, artillery, and infantry into cohesive battle groups. He taught concealment and deception in terrain that seemed to offer no cover. He emphasized improvisation during equipment shortages, making do with what they had rather than waiting for what they needed. And he brought everyone, from generals to privates, into intimate contact with higher strategic and tactical principles. "I do not want automators serving under me," Hobart told his officers. He wanted thinking soldiers who understood not just what they were doing, but why they were doing it. A soldier who understood the purpose behind his orders could adapt when circumstances changed. A soldier who merely followed instructions would be lost the moment the plan fell apart, and plans always fell apart. The division adopted a distinctive emblem, the black jerboa, a small desert rodent known for its resilience and ability to survive in harsh conditions. The name stuck. They became the Desert Rats. It was a badge they would carry with pride through years of combat across North Africa. General Sir Richard O'Connor, who later commanded the Western Desert Force in its stunning victory over the Italians, called Hobart's creation the best-trained division I have ever seen. But Hobart had made powerful enemies who were determined to destroy him. Enemies who cared more about personal grudges than military effectiveness. Lieutenant General Sir Robert Gordon Finlayson, Commander-in-Chief Egypt, until July 1939, despised Hobart with a hatred that was personal as well as professional. Upon Hobart's arrival, Gordon Finlayson greeted him with words that made his intention clear. "I don't know what you've come here for, and I don't want you anyway." Gordon Finlayson remembered the divorce scandal of 1928. He had been among those who disapproved of Hobart's marriage, and he had never forgiven him. Now he had Hobart under his command, and he intended to use that power. Gordon Finlayson wrote a devastating fitness report on Hobart, describing him as difficult to serve with or understand, impetuous in judgments which are not as consistent, and confidence-bearing as a commander's should be, possessing an unfortunate manner, and not likely to qualify for the highest command and appointment. This report would follow Hobart and poison his reputation with every senior officer who read it. When Lieutenant General Henry Maitland Wilson, known as Jumbo for his enormous size, replaced Gordon Finlayson in mid-1939, Hobart briefly hoped for better treatment. He and Wilson had attended Staff College together in 1920. Surely an old acquaintance would give him a fair hearing. He was wrong. After a disastrous exercise in October 1939, an exercise that Wilson himself had suggested, Wilson publicly humiliated Hobart and wrote a scathing letter to General Sir Archibald Wavell on November 10th, requesting his removal. "There is no confidence in his ability to command the Armoured Division to their satisfaction," Wilson wrote. He condemned Hobart for over-centralization of command and for tactical ideas based upon the invincibility of the tank to the exclusion of the employment of other arms in correct proportion. The letter ended with an unambiguous demand. "I request, therefore, that a new commander be appointed to the Armoured Division." Wavell, the new Commander-in-Chief Middle East, had his own reasons to dislike Hobart. During exercises in 1934, Hobart had vocally criticized Wavell's umpiring, accusing him of imposing unfair obstacles on the armored forces. Wavell's wife was among the ladies who thoroughly disapproved of Hobart's marriage. And before arriving in Egypt, Wavell had been regularly shown Hobart's confidential fitness reports by Gordon Finlayson, a violation of protocol that poisoned any chance of a fair hearing. On November 14th, 1939, Wavell conducted a personal interview with Hobart. The outcome was predetermined. On December 4th, Major General Michael O'Moore replaced him as commander of the division he had created. When Hobart departed Egypt, the troops of the Mobile Division lined the road to cheer their general on his way. They knew what their superiors refused to acknowledge. Hobart had made them into the finest armoured formation in the British Army. Percy Hobart's career appeared to be over. In early 1940, Major General Percy Hobart was placed on retired pay, compulsorily retired at age 54. The man who had created the world's best armored division was thrown out of the army he had served for 36 years. His wife Dorothea later recalled this as the one time in their life together that the general had shown distress over any reverse. He was a stricken man, she said years later. To anyone lacking his intense fortitude, the wound would have been mortal. No warning whatever was given that this blow was to fall. An appeal was made to King George VI for Hobart's reinstatement. The War Office never forwarded it to the monarch. The establishment had closed ranks against him. On March 9th, 1940, the man who had trained the world's best armoured division enlisted in the local Defence Volunteers, later renamed the Home Guard, as a Lance Corporal at Chippingcampden, Gloucestershire. His weapon was a homemade pike, a piece of scaffolding with a 1913 Remington bayonet welded to it. This artifact still exists. You can see it today at the Tank Museum in Bovington, Dorset, a testament to one of military history's most absurd injustices. A major general armed with a drain pipe. At once, according to contemporaries, Chippingcampden became a hedgehog of bristling defiance. Even as a corporal, Hobart couldn't help but transform everything he touched. He organized the village's defenses with the same energy he had brought to armored divisions. He was soon promoted to deputy area organizer. But the fundamental absurdity remained. One of Britain's foremost military thinkers was being transported to his duties in a baby Austin driven by a member of the Women's Volunteer Services, while his ideas were conquering Europe in German hands. As Hobart guarded his village with a homemade pike, the German army demonstrated exactly what his theories could accomplish in the wrong hands. In May of 1940, German panzer divisions smashed through the Ardennes forest, terrain that French generals had declared impassable to armor, and drove to the English Channel in just 10 days. France, which possessed the most powerful army in Europe, defended by the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind virtually all its heavy equipment. 300,000 men escaped, but only because the Germans paused at a crucial moment. The tactics that crushed France were Hobart's tactics. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was built on principles he had pioneered: deep armored penetration, radio coordination, combined arms operations, relentless speed that never allowed the enemy to establish a new defensive line. Guderian's panzers moved exactly as Hobart had taught his tanks to move on Salisbury Plain. Meanwhile, Hobart's former division, the desert rats he had trained, would soon use his methods to crush the Italian army at Bellafome in February 1941. 30,000 men with 200 tanks would defeat an Italian force of 130,000, capturing 130,000 prisoners at a cost of under 500 British casualties. They were proving everything he had advocated. Would anyone notice? Would anyone care? Would Percy Hobart ever get the chance to prove himself? The answer came from an unlikely source, a Sunday newspaper and an angry Prime Minister. On August 11, 1940, Britain's leading military theorist Basil Liddell Hart published an article in the Sunday Pictorial with a headline designed to provoke, "We have wasted brains." The article featured a prominent photograph of a hawk-faced officer in the black beret of the Royal Tank Corps. It detailed how this armored warfare pioneer, the man who had trained the desert rats, the man whose ideas the Germans had used to conquer France, was now serving as a Home Guard corporal armed with a homemade pike. It was an indictment of the entire British military establishment. Winston Churchill read the article that Sunday morning at Chequers, his country residence in Buckinghamshire. According to accounts, he threw down the newspaper with an angry scowl on his face. Here was Britain, fighting for its survival, and one of its greatest tank experts was defending a village with a drain pipe, while the Germans used his ideas to threaten invasion. Churchill and Hobart were not strangers. They had first met at a Royal Tank Corps dinner in 1935. In 1936, during Churchill's political wilderness years when he was excluded from power partly because of his warnings about German rearmament, Brigadier Hobart had visited Churchill's London apartment in civilian clothes to informally advise him about Britain's inadequate tank forces. They had shared the frustration of being right when the establishment refused to listen. Now Churchill was Prime Minister, and Britain was fighting for its survival. He needed men like Hobart, not guarding villages with pikes, but building the armoured forces that might one day liberate Europe. Churchill sent General Sir Frederick Pyle to Chippingcampden to persuade Hobart to return to the army. Hobart initially resisted, telling Pyle that he wouldn't come back until his honor was fully restored. He had been humiliated, cast aside, his reputation destroyed by men who cared more about personal grudges than military effectiveness. Why should he return to an institution that had treated him so shamefully? Eventually, Hobart relented. On October 13, 1940, Corporal Hobart met Prime Minister Churchill at Chequers. The contrast must have been striking. The Prime Minister of the British Empire and the Home Guard Lance Corporal discussing how to win a modern war. The two men walked the grounds together. Then Churchill invited Hobart into his library. What would it take to win a truly modern war? Churchill asked. Hobart didn't hesitate. 10 armored divisions. How many tanks? 10,000 tanks. Churchill nodded. This was exactly the kind of bold thinking he needed. Thinking that matched the scale of the challenge Britain faced. But Field Marshal Sir John Dill, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, didn't want Hobart back. The same institutional forces that had destroyed Hobart's career were still in power, still hostile, still determined to keep this difficult man out of the army. On October 19, 1940, Churchill wrote to Dill one of the most remarkable letters of the war, a letter that would be quoted for decades as a defense of unconventional thinking. In military leadership, we are now at war, fighting for our lives, and we cannot afford to confine army appointments to officers who have excited no hostile comment in their career. The catalogue of General Hobart's qualities and defects might almost exactly have been attributed to most of the great commanders of British history. Cromwell, Wolfe, Clive, Gordon, and in a different sphere Lawrence all, had very close resemblance to the characteristics set down as defects. They had other qualities as well, and so I am led to believe has General Hobart. This is the time to try men of force and vision, and not to be exclusively confined to those who are judged thoroughly safe by conventional standards. Dill objected. Churchill overruled him. The Prime Minister had spoken. In February 1941, Hobart was given command of the 11th Armoured Division with his rank of Major General restored. He threw himself into the task with the same intensity he had brought to the Desert Rats. The division he inherited was raw and undertrained green troops with inadequate equipment and little understanding of armoured warfare. Within months, it had become one of the finest formations in the British Army. Hobart's methods, his insistence on understanding tactics, his demanding standards, his ability to inspire men to exceed their own expectations, proved just as effective in the English countryside as they had in the Egyptian desert. But his enemies hadn't given up. In September 1942, as the 11th Armoured Division prepared for deployment to Tunisia, Hobart's detractors tried again to remove him, this time on medical and age grounds. At 57, they argued, he was too old for active command. A medical board raised concerns about his health. Churchill intervened even more forcefully than before. In a memorandum to the Secretary of State for War on September 4, 1942, he wrote, "I see nothing in these reports which would justify removing this officer from command of his division on its grueling grounds. I have been shocked at the persecution to which he has been subjected. The high commands of the army are not a club. It is my duty, and that of His Majesty's government, to make sure that exceptionally able men, even though not popular with their military contemporaries, should not be prevented from giving their services to the Crown." Hobart stayed, but his final assignment was about to begin, one that would prove more important than anyone could have imagined. The 79th Armoured Division was formed on August 14, 1942, as a standard armoured formation under Northern Command. In October of that year, General Sir Alan Brooke, now Chief of the Imperial General Staff and a Hobart admirer, offered Hobart command. By March 1943, the division faced disbandment for lack of resources. But Brooke made what he later called a happy brainwave. Instead of breaking up the 79th, he gave Hobart a new and unprecedented mission: develop specialized armored vehicles to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The disastrous Dieppe raid of August 1942 had proven that conventional tanks couldn't survive on defended beaches. The Canadian forces that attacked had lost nearly all their armor. Mines destroyed tanks before they could engage the enemy. Obstacles blocked them in the shallows. Concrete bunkers shattered them with anti-tank fire. The infantry, deprived of armor support, was slaughtered on the beaches. Something completely new was needed. Ordinary tanks were death traps on a defended beach. What was required were tanks that could swim, tanks that could clear mines, tanks that could destroy bunkers, tanks that could bridge obstacles, specialized machines for specialized problems. Hobart was suspicious at first. He consulted with Liddell Hart before accepting, demanding assurance that the 79th would be an operational combat unit, not just a training and development organization that would be sidelined when the real fighting began. When Brooke agreed, Hobart took command on October 16, 1942. His first directive established his philosophy: the success of the invasion depends on the element of surprise caused by new equipment. Suggestions from all ranks for improvements in equipment are to be encouraged. The division was renamed the 79th Experimental Armoured Division, Royal Engineers, and headquartered at Herts Hall, Saxmundham, Suffolk. The unit's insignia became a black bull's head with flaring nostrils superimposed over a yellow triangle, fierce and unmistakable, carried proudly on every vehicle. What emerged from Hobart's workshops would change military history. The specialized vehicles that Hobart developed and trained his division to operate became known as Hobart's Funnies, though there was nothing funny about their purpose. Each was designed to solve a specific problem that had destroyed tanks and killed soldiers at Dieppe. Double D stood for duplex drive, a 32-ton Sherman tank fitted with a collapsible canvas flotation screen supported by rubber tubes and metal struts. When inflated, the screen rose to form a boat-shaped hull around the tank, providing sufficient buoyancy to float the vehicle with about 3 feet of freeboard. Twin propellers powered by the tank's engine provided propulsion at roughly 4 miles per hour. Upon reaching the beach, the screen collapsed in seconds and the tank emerged ready to fight with its 75mm gun. Hungarian engineer Nicholas Strassler invented the system. Hobart made it work in combat. Over 2,000 Double D tanks were produced for the invasion. A mine-clearing tank with a rotating drum mounted on twin arms at the front. 43 heavy chains ending in fist-sized steel balls whipped the ground ahead of the tank at tremendous speed, detonating mines harmlessly before the tank reached them. A path 10 feet wide could be cleared at about 1¼ miles per hour. Unlike earlier flail designs, the Crab was powered by the tank's main engine through a special drive system, and it retained its 75mm gun for combat after clearing the minefield. South African engineer Captain Abraham du Toit originated the flail concept in the desert. Hobart perfected it for the invasion. Approximately 1,000 Crabs were produced. The armored vehicle Royal Engineers was a heavily modified Churchill tank carrying a devastating petard spigot mortar. This weapon fired a 40-pound flying dustbin demolition bomb, so named for its shape, up to 110 yards with tremendous accuracy. The projectile could destroy concrete fortifications that conventional tank guns couldn't dent. The AVRE could also mount fascine carriers, bundles of wooden poles 8 feet in diameter for filling ditches and tank traps. It could carry small box girder bridges spanning 30-foot gaps, supporting up to 40 tons. It could lay bobbin carpet, a canvas roadway reinforced with metal tubes, for crossing soft sand that would bog conventional vehicles. Lieutenant J.J. Denovan of the Royal Canadian Engineers proposed the AVRE concept after Dieppe. Hobart built over 750 of them. A flame-throwing tank that replaced the hull machine gun with a flame projector connected by an armored pipe to a 400-gallon fuel trailer towed behind the vehicle. The trailer was heavily armored and could be jettisoned if hit or empty. Range exceeded 120 yards. Approximately 81-second bursts were possible before the fuel ran out. The psychological effect was devastating. German positions often surrendered after the first ranging shots of unignited fuel, knowing what was coming next. 800 conversion kits were produced, a turretless Churchill with folding ramps at both ends and metal trackways along the body. The tank drove into a ditch or against an obstacle, dropped its ramps, and other vehicles drove over it like a bridge. The ARC crew simply sat inside while tank after tank drove over their vehicle. 2 ARCs positioned side by side could span gaps up to 65 feet. American-designed amphibious carriers operated by 79th Armoured Division units for crossing water obstacles. These tracked vehicles could carry troops or cargo from ship to shore and across rivers, canals, and flooded areas. Hobart didn't invent all these vehicles. He was the organizer and driving force who brought together existing concepts, pushed them to operational readiness, solved countless engineering problems, and trained crews to use them effectively under fire. His genius was integration, making diverse technologies work together as a system. Training for the invasion was intense, secret, and dangerous. Double D tank crews practiced at Fritton Lake in freshwater, learning to handle the ungainly vehicles with their inflated screens. Then they graduated to Stokes Bay in saltwater, where the waves and currents of the English Channel could be simulated. Many tanks sank during training, crews drowned. But Hobart pushed forward, knowing that the alternative, landing without the Funnies, would be far worse. AVRE crews rehearsed on mock-ups of German fortifications at Orford, learning exactly how to position their vehicles for maximum effect with the petard mortar. They practiced laying fascines in ditches, deploying bridges under fire, rolling out bobbin carpet on soft ground. Crab operators practiced flailing through simulated minefields until the procedure became automatic. Crocodile crews trained to deliver flame with precision, learning the range and spread of their terrible weapon. The training was realistic to the point of brutality. Live ammunition was used, men were killed and injured in exercises. But Hobart knew that nothing in training could match the chaos of actual combat, and he was determined that his crews would be as prepared as humanly possible. By early 1944, Hobart was ready to demonstrate his arsenal to the top Allied commanders. On January 27th and February 11th, General Eisenhower visited the 79th training area at Orford, accompanied by Field Marshal Brooke. Hobart led them through detailed briefings on tactics and demonstrations of equipment. They watched Double D tanks swim ashore, their canvas screens collapsing to reveal combat-ready Shermans. They watched crabs flail through minefields, the chains throwing up, geysers of sand, and the occasional detonation of a practice mine. They watched AVREs blast mock bunkers with the petard, the 40-pound bombs reducing concrete structures to rubble. They watched Crocodiles spray flame across test positions, the roar of ignition and the wall of fire impressive even in demonstration. Eisenhower was impressed. Field Marshal Montgomery, Hobart's brother-in-law and commander of ground forces for the invasion, insisted that the Americans be offered a share of the Funnies, up to a third of available vehicles. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army that would assault Omaha and Utah beaches, made a decision that would cost thousands of lives. He declined all of Hobart's specialized vehicles except the Double D swimming tanks. Bradley's reasoning was logistical rather than tactical. The Funnies were based primarily on Churchill tanks, which the Americans didn't use. Accepting them would require retraining operators on unfamiliar vehicles, retraining maintenance crews on different mechanical systems, and establishing a separate supply chain for spare parts and ammunition. All in the months before the invasion, when every hour counted. A document from February 16, 1944, shows that Bradley's staff did request some specialized equipment, 25 Sherman flails, 100 Crocodiles, and British crude AVREs for support. But the British War Office couldn't produce sufficient vehicles for both Allied forces before D-Day. The Americans would have to make do with what they had. The decision seemed reasonable at the time. The consequences would become clear on June 6th. By June of 1944, the 79th Armoured Division had grown to 21,000 officers and men with nearly 7,000 vehicles, compared to a normal Armoured Division's 40,000 men and 350 armoured fighting vehicles. It was the largest division to fight in Europe, a testament to the scale of Hobart's undertaking. On the night of June 5th, as the largest invasion fleet in history, assembled in the English Channel, Hobart's Funnies waited in their landing craft. Double D tanks were ready to swim, their canvas screens folded but ready to inflate. Crabs were ready to flail, their drums locked in travel position. AVREs were ready to blast, their petards loaded with 40-pound bombs. Crocodiles were ready to burn, their fuel trailers topped off. The men who would operate these strange machines knew that everything depended on whether the inventions would actually work when the bullets started flying. Training was one thing, combat was another entirely. Percy Hobart had been demoted to corporal, rescued by Churchill, and given the most important assignment of his life. Now, after years of preparation, the moment of truth had arrived. D-Day was about to begin. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history struck the coast of Normandy. 156,000 Allied troops would land that day on 5 beaches, Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold, Juno, and Sword for the British and Canadians. Hobart's Funnies would land on the 3 British and Canadian beaches. The 79th never fought as a unified formation. Its vehicles were distributed as small units to support the assault divisions, exactly as Hobart had planned. AVREs went to the assault engineer squadrons. Crabs went to the specialized armor regiments. Double D tanks went to the armored battalions designated for the first wave. As the landing craft approached the shore in the grey dawn light, the Double D tanks inflated their flotation screens and prepared to plunge into the cold, choppy waters of the English Channel. The crabs prepared to lower their flail drums. The AVREs loaded their petards with 40-pound demolition bombs. The Crocodile crews checked their fuel lines one last time. And on Omaha Beach, where the Americans had rejected the Funnies 32 Double D tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion launched into seas far rougher than training conditions had ever simulated. The Double D tanks at Omaha were launched 5 kilometers from shore, far too distant in the heavy swells that morning. The canvas flotation screens, designed for relatively calm water, couldn't handle the waves. Water poured over the tops of the screens. Tanks began to swamp and sink. Of the 32 tanks launched, 27 sank. Crews struggled to escape from tanks that plunged to the bottom of the channel. Only 2 tanks reached the beach by swimming. 3 more arrived later, landed directly from LCTS when their commander wisely decided the sea conditions made launching suicidal. The infantry hit the beach without armor support. They faced 30 to 50 meter high bluffs that provided perfect defensive positions. Terrain unique among the D-Day beaches, cliffs from which German machine gunners could pour plunging fire onto the exposed sand below. The German 352nd Infantry Division, including veterans of the Eastern Front, had been moved forward just days before. Allied intelligence had failed to detect the redeployment until June 4th, too late to change the plan. Allied bombing had missed the beach defenses due to cloud cover. The bombers, afraid of hitting their own troops, had delayed their releases and dropped their bombs inland. Naval bombardment had been too brief to neutralize the positions, only 40 minutes compared to longer barrages elsewhere. And there were no crabs to clear the minefields that waited beyond the waterline, no AVREs to blast the bunkers that poured fire onto the beach, no crocodiles to burn out the strong points that pinned down entire companies, no specialized armor to solve the problems that had killed so many Canadians at Dieppe. By the end of the day, American forces had suffered approximately 2,400 casualties at Omaha, by far the highest of any D-Day beach. Some units in the first wave lost 90% of their men, bodies washed in the surf. The beach ran red with blood. For hours it seemed the invasion might fail at this critical point. On the British and Canadian beaches the story was different. At Gold Beach, the Hampshire Regiment came ashore at Le Hamel and immediately ran into devastating fire from a German 75mm gun emplacement. The gun was positioned in a sanatorium building with clear fields of fire across the beach. Infantry attacks couldn't silence it. Sherman tanks couldn't penetrate the concrete. For hours, the position held up the entire advance in that sector. Then an AVRE of 82nd Assault Squadron moved forward. The petard roared. A 40-pound demolition bomb asked toward the sanatorium. The explosion shattered the building. A second petard round followed. Then the AVRE fired a large demolition charge into the rear entrance of the casemate. The German gun fell silent at last. The same array proceeded west along the beach and engaged another strong point, taking 20 prisoners. One vehicle, one crew, had accomplished what infantry and conventional tanks could not. At La Riviere, the 5th Battalion East Yorkshire Regiment was pinned by an anti-tank gun in a concrete emplacement. Several armored vehicles had already been knocked out trying to suppress it. Then an AVRE appeared. The 40-pound petard bomb blasted the emplacement to rubble, a casemated 88mm gun, one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal, was soon dealt with by another well-placed AVRE shot. At Juno Beach, a Churchill AVRE from 26th Assault Squadron became stuck in a ditch wire, seeking alternate routes after 2 Sherman crabs crashed together blocking the main exit. The crew faced a terrible choice: abandon their mission or find another way to keep traffic moving. They deliberately buried the tank deeper, creating a ramp that other vehicles could drive over. 4 of the 6 crew members were killed, 2 injured, but the advance continued. That tank was recovered 32 years later, in 1976. It now stands as a memorial at Graysomer, a testament to the sacrifice of the men who operated Hobart's Funnies. Across the British and Canadian beaches the pattern repeated. Crabs flailed paths through minefields that would have destroyed conventional tanks. Double D tanks emerged from the water and engaged German positions with their 75mm guns. AVREs blasted bunkers, laid bridges, filled ditches. The Crocodiles, though few were used on D-Day itself, spread terror wherever they appeared. German defenders often surrendering at the first sight of the flame projector rather than face incineration. The numbers tell a stark story, though they require careful interpretation. At Omaha Beach, with no funnies except the doomed double D tanks, approximately 34,000 troops landed, roughly 2,400 casualties, a casualty rate of about 7%. At Utah Beach, with double D tanks only but lighter defenses, approximately 21,000 troops landed, only 197 casualties, a casualty rate under 1%. At Gold Beach, with full Funnies support, approximately 25,000 troops landed, roughly 400 casualties, a casualty rate of about 1.6%. At Juno Beach, with full Funnies support but heavy defenses, approximately 1,400 troops landed, roughly 960 casualties, a casualty rate of about 4.5%. At Sword Beach, with full Funnies support, approximately 28,500 troops landed, roughly 630 casualties, a casualty rate of about 2.2%. Now, these comparisons require critical context. Omaha Beach featured unique terrain, those 30 to 50-meter bluffs that provided natural defensive positions found on no other beach. It was defended by the 352nd Infantry Division, a far superior force to the lower quality, a 716th Static Division that held most other beaches. Allied intelligence had failed to detect the 352nd's forward deployment until June 4th, too late to adjust the plan. The Funnies were one significant factor among several, not the sole determinant of success or failure. Terrain, enemy quality, naval support, air power, and sheer luck all played roles. But the specialized armor was a factor, and the men who landed behind Hobart's machines had a far better chance of surviving than those who didn't. By midnight on June 6th, the Atlantic Wall had been breached. The Allies had established 5 beachheads that would soon be linked into a continuous lodgment. Hitler's Fortress Europe had been cracked open. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. General Eisenhower's post-invasion assessment was unequivocal. The comparatively light casualty, which we sustained on all the beaches, except Omaha, were in large measure due to the success of the novel mechanical contrivances which were employed. It is doubtful if the assault forces could have firmly established themselves without the assistance of these weapons. Percy Hobart, the general who had been demoted to corporal, the man the army had tried to destroy, had helped save the invasion. D-Day was just the beginning. The 79th Armoured Division participated in virtually every major operation from June 1944 to V-Day, providing specialized support that enabled breakthrough after breakthrough. Operation Estonia captured Le Havre in September 1944, the Funnies blasting through fortifications that would have stalled conventional armor for days. The Battle of the Scheldt in October and November cleared the approaches to Antwerp, Buffalo amphibious carriers proving essential in the flooded terrain. Operation Blackcock in the Ruhr Triangle came in January 1945, Crabs and AVREs leading the way through minefields and strongpoints. Operation Veritable in the Reichswald followed in February and March 1945.